All right, so on December 25th, 2020, a bomb exploded on the street outside an AT&T network facility. When the building failed, the entire AT&T access network serving Nashville and Middle Tennessee failed as well. The outage affected nearly all forms of communication in the Nashville area. It knocked out wired home internet, it disconnected the AT&T wireless mobile network because the wireless traffic couldn't reach the mobile packet core. It caused major disruptions for economic activity because it prevented businesses from connecting to remote services and halted a lot of the credit card processing. Hospitals, some hospitals couldn't connect to remote medical records or communicate with doctors off-site. And it even shut down air traffic control when they couldn't receive the data that they needed. Possibly most concerningly, the outage prevented people from reaching 911, which is bad in normal times, but especially bad during a potential crisis. And we can watch this outage happen. Here's a heat map of the connected access network customers in the 4 days leading up to the outage. And then they all disappear. Now, it turns out the FBI believes the access network failure was an unintended side effect of the bombing. But it raises a very interesting question, which is the focus of this talk. What would it take to intentionally attack the physical access network infrastructure to cause an outage like the one we saw in Nashville? So let me quickly give some background on what access networks are and how they're deployed. Now, when I'm talking about access networks, I'm really talking about completely separate regional networks, even when they're owned by the same ISP, such as AT&T, Comcast, or Spectrum. And that's what I'm showing on the slide with the two distinct regional access networks. And these regional networks are connected by the backbone network. Each of the large providers operates a backbone that's separate from the regional networks. This backbone connects the otherwise completely separate regions and also is what connects to other networks. Right, but our focus here is on the access networks, which provide last-mile connectivity and have the primary goal of connecting customers to the backbone. And they do this through a hierarchy of network facilities that house networking equipment. At the top of the hierarchy are backbone facilities that are connected to the access network. From the backbone, traffic enters each access network through one or more aggregation facilities. Here's what one of them looks like. This is one of the aggregation facilities for Comcast's access network in the New England area. Finally, aggregation facilities forward traffic to an edge facility. These facilities aggregate thousands of customer connections. And here's what they sometimes look like. You can see they don't look like some giant fortified data center, and that's typical for the edge facilities. Right? And sometimes it makes sense just to repurpose a house. So here's an edge facility that's just a boarded up house with industrial cooling. Now, I think it's important to mention that these networks were designed at a time when intentional attacks against them were not a primary concern. The design is not new, it's actually decades old. And even a lot of the network facilities have been around for decades. The primary threat for access networks was what insurance refers to as acts of God, like trees falling on fiber or power lines, or mistakes by humans like construction workers. But over the last 20 years, our reliance on access to the internet has grown tremendously. And the Nashville outage revealed a wealth of vital services that rely on the access networks as well. All of this makes the access networks a more tempting target for attack today and as we go forward into the future. So with that background, let's talk about how someone could disable access network facilities. Right, so we're focused on physical attacks against the access network facilities that don't require any special access. So no entry into the building, no insider information, like the kind of information that could be obtained by working for the network. And we're focused on physical attacks. So we're not talking about cyber attacks like denial of service or subverting routers. The reason is that there's already considerable attention paid to cyber attacks, and we wanted to focus on a type of attack that we think doesn't get nearly enough attention, especially with regards to the access networks. Now, as I mentioned before, these network facilities were designed to withstand acts of God and human error. To that end, they've got redundancy to withstand independent failures. For IP transport, there's redundant fiber optic cables that enter on different sides of the building that lead to a redundant pair of routers. So if one fiber or router fails, the facility remains connected through the other one. And for power, there's obviously the power grid, as well as backup electric power to keep the routers powered for at least several hours. So how could an attacker disable these facilities? Well, by violating the independent failure assumption. If an attacker is able to locate a facility, they can cut the fiber optic cables on both sides. Alternatively, the attacker could cut the power to the building by damaging the power lines and disabling the generator, or by damaging the equipment for the failover switch where the grid and generator meet. And to clarify, cutting either the fiber or the power is enough to disable a facility. Right? And alternatively, the attacker could damage the facility in some way, such as using explosives. Right? So it's possible to disable an access network facility without special access. But what I think can make this an especially compelling form of attack is that it's also possible to identify the optimal set of facilities to disconnect in order to cause a desired outage. So in a previous paper, we were able to use tools like traceroute to infer the facility-level structure of the access networks and identify the facilities at the top of that hierarchy, either at the backbone or the aggregation layer. So these maps can provide a pretty good estimate of the blast radius for an outage. Right? Using these maps, we can look back at the Nashville outage, where the maps reveal there's only one backbone facility connected to the access network. Right? And this is why the entire access network failed after the bombing that damaged the backbone facility. But we were able to do this for a bunch of different networks around the US. For example, here's an access network that serves 4 different New England states. If someone were to disable those 2 aggregation facilities in Woburn and Needham, Massachusetts, it would sever the internet connection for millions of people and likely tens of thousands of businesses. All right, so that's how someone could cause large-scale outages. But it's also possible that an attacker might have a more targeted attack in mind, where they want to disconnect part of a city or a town. In that case, they'd likely prefer to disconnect an edge facility, which is a much softer target. There's rarely anyone staffing them. The question is, can an attacker figure out which one or more edge facilities serves a desired target area? And we discovered that they probably can. We went on a war driving expedition all around San Diego, connecting to publicly available Wi-Fi networks provided by retail stores and restaurants. And from each of these places, we sent a few trace routes to see what edge facility that store was connected to. And here I've zoomed in on a small part of the map to show that we were able to get a pretty good indication of the coverage for the edge facilities. I think this is a pretty useful proof of concept, and if someone were very careful with this mapping effort, they could probably refine it even further. All right, so now the attacker can learn which facilities to disconnect, but they still need to be able to precisely locate them in order to sever the internet connection. And these locations are not trivial to find. They're generally not listed in Google Maps, and the networks usually don't put their street addresses online. All right, so internet sleuthing is sort of the general approach here, but we found one specific way that works pretty well in a bunch of different areas. Nearly everywhere in the US makes you register hazardous materials, and typically diesel fuel tanks for backup generators are considered hazardous material. In a lot of places, this registration data is public and includes both the name of the registered entity along with the street address location of the hazardous material. So on the slide, I've got most of the facilities in a Florida access network serving the area near Pompano Beach that we found using this technique. And with these records, we were even able to identify the aggregation facilities because of the higher backup fuel needs compared to the smaller edge facilities. And of course, this is just one example, but we were able to do this in more places than just South Florida. All right, so now that I've talked about how to attack the access network infrastructure, is there anything we can do to help the situation? So I'll be honest, I unfortunately don't yet have the answer. Our main motivation with this work is to alert the community to what we view as a coming threat. But I do want to share some lessons from our discussions with access network operators. In their view, the 2 biggest barriers to any solution are the additional financial costs and the added network management complexity. We also learned that they currently worry far more about naturally occurring failures, like acts of God and human error, than intentional attacks. So potential solutions to the security problem that make recovering from these common failures more difficult, like trying to hide infrastructure, are likely non-starters. All right, so to wrap up, we think there's a coming threat against the increasingly important access network infrastructure. We found that it's possible to disconnect facilities without any insider access or information by either cutting the electric power or the fiber transport. An attacker can predict and locate the optimal facilities to disconnect with a combination of inferred topology maps, war driving and hazmat records, and finally, mitigating the threat of intentional attack, or even increasing the difficulty of an attack is non-trivial. It's complicated by financial cost, management complexity, and the ease with which networks can recover from more common failure modes. So thank you.